Welcome to Zero. I am Akshat Rathi. This week, Canada, climate, and Trump. Earlier this week, new tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump went into effect. They are astonishing. They imposed 25% duties on Canadian imports to the US. And at the time of this recording, they've already sparked chaos in the markets and provoked retaliation from Canada. It all comes as Canada's government is in the middle of a reckoning. The race to replace Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is fully underway. Next week, the governing Liberal Party will announce Trudeau's successor. And before October, if not sooner, the country will have to head for a general election. If the Liberals lose that election, the opposition Conservative Party has promised to dismantle federal climate policies, much like Trump administration has done in the US. With so much change in the backdrop, last week I got a chance to sit down with Rick Smith, president of the Canadian Climate Institute, to talk about what shape the country's climate ambitions might take in this new era. We discussed why Canada's oil and gas production has remained so high and what Trump's moves might mean for Canadian economic and energy policy. He also told me why he expects that meaningful climate policy in Canada will likely come from provinces and municipalities as much as it does from the federal government. Welcome to the show, Rick.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, we are talking as the Liberal Party is about to elect a new leader, and Canada is set to head for a general election sometime before October. Before we get to the complications of now, tell us more about the Canadian Climate Institute, where you've been president for 4 years. What has it accomplished in its 5-year life that you are particularly proud of?
Well, I think the aspiration of the organization when it was launched 5 years ago has been realized, which was to create an independent, expert climate change advisor for governments in Canada. So we were originally launched to provide good ideas, good research to our federal government. And since we've been launched, we've grown quite an extensive root system across the country. We now work with provincial governments, with municipal governments, with Indigenous nations who have substantial constitutional rights in our country. So we're probably the most quoted climate change research outfit in the country. I'm very proud of the work we do, not just in the area of mitigation, but also adaptation. We have a whole team that worries about wildfires and flooding, of course, increasingly prominent climate-driven effects across the country. We have a team of researchers that are focused on clean growth. And so we're as patriotic Canadians, we're interested in providing good ideas as to how the Canadian economy can prosper through this transitional period. And we actually just launched a dedicated Indigenous research unit to work directly with our Indigenous nations. So we've deepened our work across the country. We've expanded it, and I think it's been very helpful to driving climate progress across the country.
So on Zero, we've had the UK's Climate Change Committee feature a few times because it was one of the first ones to be created as part of a country's legally binding climate targets. Now, the Canadian Climate Institute is a sister organization, though not a one-to-one in comparison, right? The CCC here has quite a bit of power because it can tell a government off by telling them, look, there's a carbon budget that you've set as a legally binding goal. You're not on track. And here are the set of policies that are available to you to choose to get back on track. You don't quite have the same ability because of the way you've been created. So what are the differences and how do they manifest in your work?
Yeah. Well, you're right. I mean, the CCC was created in 2008, so our country is a little bit behind. The Canadian version of the Climate Change Act was adopted in 2021. Actually, interestingly, we in the CCC and colleague organizations in about 24 other countries launched an international network together at COP26. What we have in common is we are expert advisors to our respective national governments on climate policy specifically. And you're right, there are some differences between us. So some of our colleague organizations like the CCC are creatures of parliament. Some of our organizations like ours are independent charities. But what we have in common is we have a formal relationship of some sort with our national governments to provide good advice, to track progress, and to suggest improvements in terms of getting back on track.
So talking of progress, the Canadian government under Justin Trudeau has set a goal to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030 relative to 2005 levels. And the latest check on emissions that you provided last year through CCI shows that the decarbonization of electricity is going well, but oil and gas sector emissions are rising. I had the pleasure to interview Justin Trudeau on invitation from the Canadian Climate Institute back in 2022. And my first question to him was that all G7 countries have grown their economies and reduced their emissions. Canada has not. Its emissions were at that time largely flat. Has there been progress since then?
You've packed a heck of a lot into that question. Let me unpack that a little bit. Let's just start by looking at where Canada's at in terms of decarbonization. Yes, I'm delighted to report that there has been progress since 2022. In fact, since 2005, national emissions overall in Canada are down about 8%, according to our calculations. I think we're going to be down again in this next year. So, good news. For the first time in the country's history, we've inflected the carbon curve downward. But if you dig down a little bit, what you see is real differences between sectors. So fantastic news in our electricity sector, for instance, electricity sector emissions down about 60% since 2005. Most provinces now off of coal, significant uptake of renewables across the country, including in provinces governed by conservative parties provincially. So great things happening. And clearly the regulatory framework driving decarbonization in the electricity sector is largely working. Buildings, some decarbonization happening, again, a little bit variable by province. In terms of transportation decarbonization, some variability by province, a big uptake of electric vehicles in some provinces, not so much in others. Where we see more progress needed is when it comes to oil and gas industry emissions. So those,
which are increasing.
So those emissions are actually increasing about 10% up since 2005 overall. Interestingly, as we see now emissions going down in other sectors, we see the percentage of oil and gas sector emissions, that chunk of the Canadian emissions pie, increasing, and it's now over 30% of national emissions attributable to oil and gas production.
And all this is before Donald Trump took White House. And since his election, of course, there's been a huge amount of focus now in Canada on energy security, on diversification of energy markets, which suggests that more pipelines will be built, perhaps not to the US, but to the east and west coast, so that Canada can continue to export its fossil fuels. How concerned are you that the net impact of whatever Trump does is actually going to increase Canada's reliance on extractive industries and further increase oil and gas emissions?
Yeah. Look, it's inarguable that what President Trump is doing, what his administration is doing with respect to climate policy is uniformly unhelpful. I do think that there's a lot of dust that has to settle over the next few months in terms of the actual impact of these things. Unclear, for instance, whether the president's administration can overturn, without congressional approval, a lot of the very helpful tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. It is unclear the extent to which the Trump administration can overrule the 24 or so U.S. states, led by California and New York, some of the biggest states, who've served notice that they are going to proceed with ambitious electricity sector decarbonization, electric vehicle regulated sales targets. The U.S. Climate Alliance states represent about 50% of the U.S. population. And what we see at the moment, I mean, with vehicles in the United States, for instance, is basically a bifurcated market where you have the California-led group of states administering a European-style ZEV mandate, and then you have the federal government tailpipe standards being followed by the other half of the U.S. economy. Of course, the U.S., like Canada, is a federal country. States have substantial constitutional authority to regulate in areas relevant to climate policy. So, as unhelpful as the Trump administration wants to be, as much as they want to impede climate progress, I would suggest it's premature to jump to conclusions about how far they're going to get.
But if we're looking at the numbers, from 2005 levels, emissions are down as of 2023 by 8%. They need to be down as a legally bound target by 40% by 2030. And so the pace has to pick up. But at this point, when the focus is being drawn away from climate into much more carbon-intensive industrial conversation, even if there is no, right now on paper, direct impact, doesn't that slow down progress at a time when it actually needs to accelerate?
Well, it's certainly not going to help. I mean, you're absolutely right. And in fact, according to our analysis, absent adding some new policies to the table, Canada is actually not on track for 40 to 45% reduction by 2030. By our calculation, at the current rate, we're probably headed towards something like 35% or slightly less. So we've provided to the federal government over the last couple of years a variety of suggestions in terms of how to accelerate progress, how to both increase the effectiveness of existing policy and add some new policy to the table to get us on track. I do want to underline here that Canada is a federal country. And so one of the things that I suspect you're going to see in Canada over the next few years is climate change advocates, regardless of what happens in our federal election. I think there's the acknowledgement in the climate policy community that more attention needs to be put on provincial action, on municipal action, partially because we've had a relatively sympathetic federal government over the last decade. Virtually all of the attention in terms of climate policy has been focused in the federal government. And in our system, there's only so far the federal government can get in many areas of climate policy and regulation. So in many cases, for instance, the federal government has tried to do something, has been taken to court by provinces. That continues. My point here is that even in a Trump era that will extend for some years, there is substantial scope in the United States, in Canada, for subnational action. And in fact, it's already the case that some of those important subnational actors are creating cross-border cooperation. So Quebec and California, for instance, have long been part of a common carbon credit market. And I suspect we're going to see more of that continental subnational action in the years ahead. And some of these subnational actors are very large, of course. If California were its own country, it would be the 5th largest economy on the planet. So these are not small actors here. They're consequential.
Point taken that provincial governments can do a lot. But when you do have climate policies at the federal level, they can add up to how much more provinces can do. Now, one of Trudeau's signature climate policy was to put a price on pollution and then give most of that money back to citizens. So the poorest people would get more money back from the government than they would potentially spend on higher costs in goods. And richer people who have more carbon-intensive lifestyles will pay more. All the leaders in Canada who are now vying to be in power, we have the Liberal Party that's going through its own election that'll get concluded sometime in March, and then the Parliament will come back, and at some point there will be a general election. All the leaders who want to be in power in Canada are now promising, in one form or the other, to roll back some of the price on pollution. Can you talk through what type of rollback are we likely to see?
In the last couple of years in our country, we've kind of backed ourselves into this strange cul-de-sac when it comes to climate policy. By our institute's calculations, best case scenario, the contribution of the Canadian consumer carbon price to emission reductions by 2030 is at best 10%. And yet, for a variety of reasons, political and otherwise, the debate surrounding the fate of the consumer carbon price has probably occupied, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that 95% of the entire climate change discussion in our country has swirled around this one policy for at least 2 years. And we need to get out of that. One of the things we've done over the last couple of years is pointed to the fact that we need to focus on climate policy progress across a range of policies. And there are many other policies that are far more consequential in terms of emission reduction.
Name a few.
The industrial carbon price, probably 30 to 40% of the solution by 2030, partially because it's applied to a much larger basket of emissions than the consumer carbon price. Continued electrification across the country, penetration, various policies meant to expedite the uptake of electric vehicles. Our methane partially because the oil and gas sector is so large, methane regulations, a huge part of the solution by 2030. So there's probably a couple of dozen other policies that are important in terms of progress by 2030 that are relatively unexamined in the public debate and that need some improvement. And so, obviously it's not ideal if the country moves off of consumer carbon pricing in an age when affordability concerns animate all aspects of politics. I'm not sure it's surprising, to be honest. But there are other policies that are far more important.
So if the industrial carbon price is going to do so much of the heavy lifting going into 2030s, I know you can't comment on specific political parties, but at least one of the major parties, the Conservatives, are trying to push back against any form of carbon pricing, which might even weaken the industrial carbon price, right?
Well, it's actually, the industrial carbon price is actually quite a different system in our country than the consumer price. Now, I think it's important to note here that industrial carbon pricing, unlike consumer carbon pricing, has not been the topic of a raging public discussion over the last few years. And one reason is that industrial carbon pricing was invented at a provincial level and then spread across the country. And this trajectory of public policy, the move from a province to a national level phenomenon, is actually a hallmark of sometimes enduring Canadian public policy. This is what happened with our Medicare system, our public health care system, for instance. So I think there's some basis to believe that there's many heavy emitting industries across the country that are quite supportive of industrial carbon pricing, because one of the things it does is create a lucrative credit market, and those credits now exist on balance sheets right across the country. So industrial carbon pricing, which only applies to exporting industries, so there is no interface with Canadian consumers, meant to both reduce emissions and increase the competitiveness of Canadian industry. And so I think that's a winning argument.
After the break, more of my conversation with Rick Smith of the Canadian Climate Institute. By the way, if you've been enjoying this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple and Spotify. It helps other listeners find the show. If it wasn't already, the 2023 record-breaking wildfires in Canada showed people the scale and the intensity that climate-driven extreme weather events can bring. At the CCI, you also look at how Canada can adapt to climate change.
Yeah.
Adaptation is often the forgotten cousin in the climate equation. People only think really about reducing emissions. How is Canada doing on the adaptation front?
Adaptation is an increasing part of the debate in our country. In the last few years, the table has been completely reset in terms of the public understanding of climate-driven extreme weather. Last summer alone, over a few days in August in southern Quebec, that province saw devastating flooding and actually the most expensive natural disaster in Quebec's history last August. In the west of our country, the beautiful world-renowned mountain town of Jasper essentially burned to the ground because of raging wildfires. The first stage of rebuilding that town, almost $1 billion Canadian. One of our strong partners of the Canadian Climate Institute is the Canadian insurance industry. The insurance industry fascinating to work with because as an industry, they're structurally risk averse. But yet, because of the product that they sell, they're being forced to grapple on a daily basis with the realities of climate change, the measurable realities of climate change in a way that no other industry is. And so we work with them increasingly. And the Insurance Bureau of Canada calculated 2024 to be the most expensive year in Canadian history, over $8 billion in insured losses across the country, mostly from climate-driven weather. So, whether it's wildfires in the west of our country, flooding in the east, in some parts of our country over the last couple of years, there's been both flooding and wildfires at the same time, as happened in Halifax on our east coast 2 years ago. This has transformed the Canadian understanding of climate change and in a very short period of time rendered what used to be a kind of notional discussion of effects our children and grandchildren might have to deal with sometime down the road into a far more urgent discussion of, the security of my family and of my neighbor's family and of our communities. So, I think climate change in our country has been permanently moved from an environmental policy pigeonhole into a far more powerful public policy discussion, in the same space that you see healthcare, crime, these other far more proximate threats to human security. Does that mean that every decision maker across the country is motivated to make the right decisions on climate policy every day of the week? No, but it's always there, kind of lurking under the surface, a risk to be managed by political leaders. I think that's where we're at in our country when it comes to climate change. And so we spend a lot of time at our institute trying to quantify the damage of wildfires and flooding, how to come up with policy solutions to keep Canadian communities safer. And it's become a fundamental part of our argument that too often the climate change discussion is dominated by a fixation on the alleged costs of taking action on climate change, when in fact the increasing measurable costs are the cost of our inaction. And we're seeing that across Canada every day now.
Canada and the US share the longest undefended border in the world. Canada has the US as its largest trading partner. Most of Canadian oil is going into the US. The connections run deep, not just culturally, but at an economic and at a carbon level. And so there is a very real danger that what happens in this administration derails Canada's climate plan. How are you going to start advising whichever politicians take power in the next government to deal with the Trump threat?
The speed with which the Canadian national debate has changed since January 20th is just unbelievable, since Trump's inauguration. And the focus of the national debate now is fully how to ensure the success of the national economy, given the United States has revealed itself within a matter of weeks to be a difficult partner, to be polite. If the debate is as broad as the future of the Canadian economy, there are many carbon-relevant factors to contribute there, of course. One of them is that as Canada asks itself, okay, well, if we can't reliably trade with the United States to the extent that we have in the past, and we need to start accelerating trade with other countries around the world, well, lo and behold, it turns out that a lot of those potential trading partners are implementing carbon border adjustments.
Yeah, I mean,
are rapidly decarbonizing.
There was a joke made about Canada joining the EU.
Well, yes, it turns out Canada had a very low-level conflict with Denmark a few years ago that resulted in a very small island in the Arctic being divided in two. And Canada, it turns out, shares a 1.5-kilometer border with Denmark on Hans Island in the Arctic. And so there's been actually a lot of somewhat serious suggestion in the Canadian media that we should look at joining the EU.
Well, it turns out technically the European Union has never defined what Europe really means geographically. And so, it might just happen.
Right. Well, so there you go. So we speculate on geopolitics on this podcast as well. But So there are many complicated questions bound up with this raging national debate about the future of the Canadian economy, but it can't escape the notice of Canadian decision makers that regardless what Donald Trump is doing over the next couple of years, the medium and longer term decarbonization trajectory in the world is set. So a couple of weeks ago, we saw 75% of German voters supporting political parties promising massive climate change progress. The trajectory is set in Europe. It's set in the United Kingdom. We work with colleague organizations all over the world, and so we're intimately familiar with what the decarbonization debate looks like in 24 major economies around the world. And yes, there are hiccups. Yes, there are stops and starts, but the trajectory is clear. I mean, decarbonization is an industrial imperative. This is the case that we and many others will be making in Canada, is that it's in the best interest of the Canadian economy to figure out how to compete with China when it comes to the manufacture of electric vehicles, to ensure that we are mining critical minerals in Canada, to ensure that we are doubling down on perhaps the greatest Canadian industrial asset, which is dispatchable, clean power at a time when the world desperately needs that. And every major investor in the world is looking for that in jurisdictions in which they invest. And so there are some of Canada's most important assets revolve around the building blocks of decarbonization, and we need to exploit those in the years ahead.
Well, the last time Trump came to power, there were climate leaders like Trudeau and Germany's Angela Merkel, UK's David Cameron, and later Theresa May, who were there to act as a force against the climate backlash that happened in the first term. This time around, there are few climate leaders in power. Trudeau is about to leave his position, and there are fewer climate-forward parties in the ascendancy around the world. So how exactly can leaders who understand the climate challenge meet the electorate at this moment and convince them enough that action on climate change is in their self-interest so that they can get elected to power?
Well, one of the advantages that we have now versus in Trump's first term is that some of the technology that we advocate for has matured and is cheaper than ever before. And so one of the things that we've measured across our country, for instance, is the relative affordability of low-emitting electrical options like heat pumps, electric vehicles. If you do an apples-to-apples comparison, heat pump versus fossil fuel heating, in most Canadian cities, heat pumps are the clear winner in terms of being a better deal for consumers. Why? Well, because they're more efficient machines. They're just better machines. Nobody has ever bought a heat pump and said, wow, I really regret this. I want to go back to my clunky old furnace, right? Like they're just better machines. And maybe I'm saying this as a Gen Xer who's lived through, the transition from cassette tapes to CDs to streaming and from rotary dial phones to mobile phones. Sometimes the new machines are just better.
It's true of electric cars too.
It's true of electric cars too. I mean, anybody who's driven an electric vehicle thinks the pickup's incredible, the handling's incredible. They're amazing. They're better machines. So I'm optimistic that this argument about affordability quite often I think cuts against the grain for a lot of environmental policy experts. I think quite often as environmental policy people, we default to kind of hair shirt arguments. People to turn down the thermostat and wear a sweater and suck it up because it's going to be good for them. At this moment in time, electric vehicles, heat pumps, these machines that are the foundations of a low emissions future, in many ways they sell themselves. And in fact, are so much cheaper than the fossil fuel alternatives, even in completely deregulated marketplaces like Texas and Alberta on our continent. The only two fully deregulated electricity markets on the continent are in those two jurisdictions. And guess what? When everything else is cleared away, when the only thing that matters is how much you can build your project for, When the system is completely technology agnostic, the technologies that win are wind and solar because they're so much cheaper, and that's why Texas is building so much wind and solar. And until recently, Alberta was as well. So in the years ahead, even with Trump creating whatever mayhem he tries to create, we have affordability arguments on our side, and we also have arguments about competitive necessity on our side. If North America wants to build the cars of the future at a time when 50% of cars in China are electric, we need to get a move on in terms of electric vehicle manufacturing. It's a competitive necessity. And so we need to resist this kind of future of Luddism that Trump is trying to drag us into.
Well, you're in for a political ride this year, Rick, but thank you for coming on the show and giving us a taste of what might be coming in Canada on the climate front.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Zero. And now for the sound of the week. That's the sound of ice hockey, which, like so many things these days, has become political, when the usual polite Canadians booed the American anthem in a recent game. Share this episode with a friend or with an ice hockey fan. You can get in touch at zeropod@bloomberg.net. Zero's producer is Maithili Rao. Bloomberg's head of podcast is Sage Bauman, and head of talk is Brendan Newnham. Our theme music is composed by Wonderly. Special thanks to Siobhan Wagner, Danny Bokov, and Jessica Beck. I am Akshat Rathi, back soon.